Uh-oh.
Good evening, sir. Spot check. See driver's license, ownership, insurance, please.
Sure. There it is. There we are. License is in there.
Thank you.
The insurance is in the folder.
Doing any drinking all tonight, sir?
No.
On your way home, are you?
Yes, I am.
Okay, sir. Drive carefully home tonight, then.
Thank you.
Good night.
The law says that these random spot checks for drunk drivers really do cut down fatalities on the road, and I guess that's why the majority of Canadians who live in this part of the country approve of and support that law. But it's very controversial. Some Canadians argue that it's a violation of the rights and freedoms of the individual, police stopping somebody without the slightest indication that there's been any wrongdoing. Well, in this episode of The Struggle for Democracy, I'm going to try and figure out what the law is really supposed to do in a democracy. Preserve order and stability on behalf of the state, or protect me against the government. I thought I'd start the search in Amsterdam, because for centuries, Holland has been synonymous with freedom under the law. Political and religious dissenters have traditionally found a haven here from persecution. And that includes a tiny group of English Puritans who 300 years ago left these shores as pilgrims to seek religious freedom in America. In our time, the Dutch have pushed the barriers of social freedom to their limits. Some would say beyond those limits. Amsterdam became the sex and dope capital of the world, not because the laws here are lax, but because of the peculiarly Dutch way in which they're enforced. Gert Hesges is a former local government official, a thoughtful, studious man. He's also a professional pornography peddler, running a sex shop in Amsterdam's red light district, selling pornographic books, magazines, videos, and sexual appliances.
At the moment, we have a law which gives strict description of what is forbidden and what is not. And the only thing being forbidden at the moment is sex with children, say, under 16.
Before the new law, when everything was technically forbidden, did you have to make special arrangements with the police? Were you paying off? How did it work?
Well, it works like so many things in Holland work, as long as there's no agreement on national scale. Things are being tolerated until there is a solution for it.
The Dutch are proud of their spirit of tolerance, and it goes back for centuries. And it manifests itself in a lot of strange ways, including this cafe, the Bulldog, and dozens like it here in Amsterdam. Inside the Bulldog, in addition to beer, orange juice, milkshakes, and cocktails, you can choose from a menu of hashish and marijuana. It's amazing. The drugs are totally illegal, but you won't be arrested, provided no hard drugs are involved, or people under 16, and there's no blatant advertising. The city even collects taxes from the drug sales and runs a tramway token booth on the premises.
I'm selling space cake. This is cake especially for people with sleep problems. It's just cake with a little piece of hash baked in the cake. So when you eat it after 1 hour, 2 hours, you feel pretty relaxed. You feel just fine.
Dacht ik, nu is het mijn kans. En ik zeg, oh, ik heb zo'n kiespijn.
Telephone sex is a new phenomenon in Holland, but what is really unique about it, unique to this country as far as I know, is that the fee for this kind of service is collected by the telephone company, which belongs to the government of Holland, which then forwards the profit to the people who operate the service in the first place. Now, if you want to get something a little more concrete than just sex over the phone, there's another number to dial.
listening to the Yab Yum info tape. In the next 2 minutes, we're going to tell you about a visit to our club. Imagine, the door will be opened by a friendly receptionist who'll take care of your coat.
Well, the entrance fee is 100 guilders. That's include your drinks. And if you want to go upstairs with a nice lady for an hour, then you pay me 400 more. Thank you very much. You want to follow me to the bar?
Oh, yeah.
Close to the bar, you'll find an intimate spot to dance and a comfortable lounge where you can make your acquaintance with the nicest girls in town. 1 hour of sheer pleasure with a marvelous lady will cost you 400 guilders. We accept all major credit cards.
What's different?
The owner of the Yab Yum is Theo Hüft. Knowing that his club was illegal, he did what any sensible Dutchman would do. He went to the police and sought their advice.
I make an appointment with the police on how to do. And now I have a license, so the police knows that. And that's why he say, okay, that's you can do that. I talk with him also, and we make together the formula to make it legal.
But why can you do something like this in Amsterdam where you couldn't do it in London or you...
When we have the
many
time,
citizens...
when we have the time after 10, 15 years, it's also in England. We are a little
advanced.
Yeah, a little advanced.
Amsterdam leads the way.
Yeah.
In high-class brothels.
Yes. I think so.
Oh, it's a rather free country, especially Amsterdam. I mean, you can do anything here, you know. You've named it, you've got it. That's what Amsterdam is. And I think it's very good. It's so common, so accepted by all the people. And I don't think it's shocking. No, it isn't. I just live a normal life. Well, I sleep longer. I get up about 2 o'clock at noon. But, well, the rest of my life is normal. Yeah.
Official Amsterdam has a relationship with its more marginal visitors and citizens that's, well, different. Listen to this pamphlet. Amsterdam is proud of its tolerance and freedom. Foreigners often think that everything is permitted here, even hard drugs. But the whole drug trade is illegal. So, watch your step, check the quality, don't use drugs near where you scored. If you shoot, first get a clean needle, never shoot up alone. The publisher of this useful and instructive little pamphlet is the Municipal Health Department of the City of Amsterdam. But there's a dark corner of this liberal Dutch democracy, and it's inhabited by people like Rudy Heetberg. Rudy is one of some 10,000 drug addicts in Amsterdam. He subsists on heroin, which is illegal, but which he gets without any trouble. He hasn't had a regular job in 20 years. Many junkies support their habit by theft, including the mugging of tourists. Heetberg says that he survives by dealing dope and living off the Dutch welfare system. And he gets additional support, including free, clean syringes, from the Junkies Union, whose center is paid for by the City of Amsterdam. Running the center is John Peter Koels.
At the moment someone decides to buy his first packet of heroin, one moment he's an innocent boy or girl, and the next moment he's a criminal. At the moment he sells something and he gives his money, he's a criminal. I think that when we should live in a decent society where people could choose to live the life they want to live, I'm for free drugs. When you're talking about the drugs problem, you're thinking of law and order problems.
The law in a democracy should presumably reflect community standards. Here in Amsterdam's Dam Square, I watched drugs being peddled openly. The police know and turn a blind eye. Chief Inspector Aukie Rosken is in charge of the city's vice squad.
The law is made in favor of people. So if you can help people, the people of Amsterdam, with concentrating a problem in one area, you're helping the people.
So that this tolerant posture has not increased the drug problem in your...
Certain fields you are not very tolerant. On the field of the hard drugs, you are not tolerant.
I've been approached quite openly in the middle of the Dam Square by somebody trying to sell me cocaine.
Yeah.
Now, I have to assume that you know they're there.
I hope you get cocaine if you buy it. I'm not sure. It could be that you are just robbed. Yes.
Finally, the law in Holland seems to be doing what it should do in a democracy, because the people can get at it, examine it, modify the way it's written and enforced as times and attitudes change. And that's an approach to justice and fairness and law that first appeared here when the wine-dark waters around Greece were lapping at the shores of the world's first democracy. And that idea would, in ancient Greece, take on written expression. I believe that when the human race was young, before we learned to read and write, there were democratic social arrangements amongst a number of the world's peoples with traditions and taboos that were passed along in an unspoken way, almost instinctively, through the fingertips. But once literacy arrives on the scene, I don't know of any democracy in the world's history that is not based upon written law. We know for certainty that democracy was invented here in Athens rather suddenly in the year 508 BC, and that there was a body of written law in place before that happened. They didn't call it democracy at first. Those first Athenian democrats couldn't have used the word if they wanted to. What they said was isonomia, equality before the law. And so that principle that we modern Democrats hold so dear was not only the underpinning, it was the name of the first Athenian democracy. The most famous trial by jury in Athens, indeed one of the most famous trials in Western civilization, concerned the philosopher Socrates. In his 70th year, Socrates was accused by 3 citizens of Athens of not believing in the gods in whom the city believed and of introducing other divinities. He was further charged that in his teachings he was corrupting the youth. Socrates' accusers saw the man and his constant questioning of orthodox wisdom as a dagger aimed at the heart of their new and uncertain democracy. The penalty they demanded was that he die at his own hands by drinking poison.
And Socrates then guarantees that they will vote the death penalty in a big way by sneering and making speeches about the penalty he ought to give me is that I should have dinner at public expense from now on for the service that I have performed to the state. And it does look as if a fair number of people who might not have voted to condemn him in the first place didn't like this much at all. And so he was condemned to death. Now, then we get into a very mysterious situation. According to Plato, again, in another dialogue, that nobody wanted to put him to death, and they more or less said, look, 3 o'clock this morning, the door of the jail will be open. Just go, disappear. And a couple of friends came and said, we have friends and thieves, and they'll look after you, and so on. And suddenly Socrates says, oh, no, we can't do that. I've made a kind of contract with the city. I've lived here all my life. I could have left any time, and by staying here in this way, I've accepted that I accept the laws of Athens. I think this was a wrong penalty, but it's been done in legal procedures. I don't leave. Sorry. I take the penalty that was imposed on me. Now, we haven't another text anywhere in the whole story with that kind of argument. But there it is.
But what's it got to do with democracy?
What's got to do with democracy is that Socrates has been a symbol ever since, thanks entirely to Plato, that democracy won't work. That you have mob rule, people are irrational, and they won't take a critic like Socrates and so on.
About 1,000 years ago, continental Europe and Anglo-Saxon England lived under laws made by and for kings. King's law. The Romans had brought their civil law with them when they had colonized Europe and England. And when their empire collapsed, they took it back with them. Anglo-Saxons under Alfred the Great had a legal system that helped him create a kingdom. Alfred ordered that laws written in Latin be translated so that they could be understood by the common people. And so, when William of Normandy conquered England in 1066, he acquired a kingdom with a developed notion of law and justice. And he introduced trial by battle, which may be the forerunner of the adversary system that survives still under English common law. Two sides fighting a legal battle, which will end with a winner or a loser. The monarch was enormously powerful, and yet he ruled by the consent of his most powerful subjects, who could make and unmake kings. The most far-reaching clash between the king and his subjects happened in the 13th century, when the barons forced the weak and treacherous King John to either abdicate or put his seal to a great charter, Magna Carta.
Even though it's almost 800 years since King John was forced to put his seal to it, this piece of parchment is still the single most important legal document, not just in the history of Britain, but for Canada, for the United States, for all of the nations that derived their law from the British experience. And yet, in a democratic sense, it doesn't say all that much. The great reforms and guarantees came later. So why has Magna Carta become this kind of talisman in the democratic tradition? I've been insisting throughout the series that democracy is about power. For Magna Carta, the king had all the power of the law. You might even say he was the law. But with Magna Carta, he had to agree that he was subject to the law. And out of that germ, over the centuries, grew the extraordinary idea that in a democracy, all of the citizens had equal access to the power of the law.
Even in America, which had rejected British rule, the great doors of the United States Supreme Court depict that event, which happened long before the court existed. To this day, Magna Carta is quoted in courtrooms around the world, and in the popular imagination, it represents the triumph of justice over tyranny.
I'm sorry, Mr. Winslow, but we cannot allow you a civil trial. Have you ever studied Magna Carta, sir? Not very closely, I'm afraid. Have you? Close enough to know there's a clause which states that no subject of the king may be condemned without a trial. My son, I presume, is a subject of the king, certainly, and he has been condemned without a trial. From the purely civilian point of view, yes. And from a purely civilian point of view, I'm going to fight you, sir. And I'm going to win.
But monarchs like Henry VIII would set aside Magna Carta whenever it suited them, as Sir Thomas More, the Lord Chancellor, would discover when he invoked it in his own defense on a false charge of treason. More died at the executioner's block, and many would follow him year after year in the bloody struggle between power and liberty. In the 17th century, the fight for political and religious freedom was to plunge England into its greatest crisis since the Norman invasion. What couldn't be settled by reason would be decided by civil war. The war would decide who were the lawmakers, a Protestant parliament or King Charles I.
Gentlemen of the muskets, on our divisional commander's orders, advance and present. Gentlemen of the musketeers, order your arms. Assume a lazy posture.
There were those who believed that a victory for Parliament might bring liberties unheard of in a country divided by wealth and class. More than 300 years later, the issues that divided England then still clamor for attention. These men and women are members of the Civil War Society, taking sides with passion, fascinated by the past, hoping it may help them understand the present.
In this 20 years from 1640 to 1660, this whole Civil War period in particular is the most amazing melting pot of ideas and theories, and when one starts to look at it, so many of the things that people think are new ideas actually are 350 years old.
They demanded the vote for women who had property, which was something that we didn't get in this country until the 20th century. And this is in the 17th century that they're actually demanding votes for women.
Take your dresses to the right hand.
Cromwell's parliamentary forces won the war and beheaded Charles I. The blood spilled on killing fields all over England should have produced a harvest of liberty. But it didn't happen. Cromwell's republic was bleak and intolerant. And when he died, the British cut off his corpse's head and invited the Stuart monarchs back. And the last of them, James II, set aside every reform won by battle, trampled on the law, and declared again the divine right of kings.
And that led to the last great clash between monarch and parliament. The British people had exhausted themselves fighting a civil war to win the liberties that James had stripped away from them. And so they deposed him. And ever since then, British monarchs have ruled on the terms of Parliament, and that has been a victory for the rule of law. Parliament would make the law, which would then be interpreted by independent judges that the monarch could not interfere with. Mind you, it was a Parliament controlled by rich and powerful men, but it contained the seeds of the kind of parliamentary democracy that I grew up with. And the lessons of that glorious revolution were absolutely crucial to the men and women who would later make their own revolution in America. No modern democracy ever spent so much time in public debate about the role of law as the Americans. In towns across the country, they argued and wrangled, and when they finally came up with a constitution they could agree on, they added a vital document, one that more than any other defined the role of law in a democracy. A Bill of Rights declaring unequivocally the liberties of the citizen. It was passed as a group of amendments to the Constitution in 1791, and it guaranteed, among other things, freedom of religion and speech in the press, freedom of assembly, the right to a speedy and public trial by jury, and it prohibited excessive fines and cruel punishments. The custodian of the people's rights was and is the Supreme Court. Congress made the laws, but the court would decide their constitutional legality. Judges would have power in parallel with legislators. They would be in the thick of America's political life. It has led to some remarkable paradoxes. There are two landmark decisions from this court that speak volumes about the strengths and the weaknesses and the contradictions of democracy. In 1896, with only one dissenting voice, the justices of the Supreme Court of the United States of America ruled that racial discrimination was not unconstitutional. The black ghetto world of the American Negroes was separate but equal. And then, less than 60 years later, a different group of justices repudiated that, ruling that separate education for black and white children was inherently unequal. That decision would open the doors of an all-white school to an 8-year-old black girl. But it would also light a flame that would burn and scar and finally illuminate and transfigure the face of a nation. The black girl was Linda Brown, and after a 3-year legal battle, which would end at the Supreme Court, she would win the right to attend an all-white school in her neighborhood. The decision struck a blow to segregation. Jack Greenberg, now a professor of law at Columbia University in New York, was a young civil rights lawyer representing Linda Brown and other black plaintiffs when the court made its fateful decision in the spring of 1954.
Well, we thought we'd win the case, and we'd win the cases, and that there would be compliance, and it would be slow, and it would be uneven, but eventually it would achieve school integration in some sense that we didn't fully understand. But we had no sense that the Brown case would precipitate the civil rights revolution that resulted in integration of virtually all of the institutions in the United States. That Brown itself would not only be a legal decision, but a great moral catalyst.
It was a great moral catalyst, but it had to be enforced. The Supreme Court's decision applied to every public school in America, but it was opposed by states across the land, in the North as well as the South. The media, particularly television, were to play a vitally important role in the events to come, as nightly we watched images like these and became familiar with the names of Little Rock, Meredith, Faubus, and Wallace.
I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
The fourth week of school at Little Rock, Arkansas. Monday brought the violence Governor Orville Faubus had often predicted. His bitter critics said there would be no trouble if he had not created a tense situation in the first place. As for the governor, his attitude was, I told you so.
One brave black journalist comes under attack by white mobs as the South continues to defy federal law. And the government of President Eisenhower watches, seemingly paralyzed. In a decision aimed at enforcing the issue, the Supreme Court orders school boards to draw up desegregation plans with all deliberate speed. And in Little Rock, Arkansas, state troopers keep blacks from all white schools. And finally, 3 years after the Linda Brown case, President Eisenhower orders federal troops into Little Rock to enforce integration.
Our individual rights and freedoms rests upon the certainty that the President and the executive branch of government will support and ensure the carrying out of the decisions of the federal courts, even when necessary, with all the means at the President's command.
It's a momentous decision. America will never be the same. A Supreme Court ruling on equality is no longer an abstract legal principle. It is the effective law of the land.
I would say that the Supreme Court has its limits. There are things that it can say and order which may be beyond what society is willing to do, but there's a great deal of respect for the court, and I think an initial disposition if the court says do it, people will do it.
But they may not like it. What the court had said, in effect, to the southern states of America was that their form of apartheid, which existed before South Africa coined the word and which debased and humiliated a tenth of the population, was unconstitutional, against the law. It was a hard truth to swallow.
You just can't change the laws and customs and traditions of a people that have grown up over a period of 100, 150 years. You can't change it overnight by one stroke of the pen and change it by injunctions and federal marshals and federal troops. You can't make people do what they conscientiously don't want to do.
The customs and traditions of which Governor Patterson spoke had for years virtually disenfranchised blacks in the South. Congress had passed bills giving blacks civil rights, but the southern states had ignored them, passing their own laws reinforcing segregation. Poll taxes and literacy tests kept blacks off the voter rolls and the jury lists. And there was an extrajudicial authority, the Ku Klux Klan, always there to remind blacks that whatever laws were passed to protect them, there existed a secret white army which could impose its will on them with swift and terrible force. The Klan's symbol of authority was the lynching tree. Nowhere was it used more than in Mississippi. And it was in Mississippi that there occurred one of the more macabre acts of defiance against the changes sweeping the South. In 1959, near the Mississippi town of Poplarville, a white woman was raped. Shortly afterwards, Mac Charles Parker was picked up by the police and charged with the crime. He would eventually go before an all-white jury, which the town was confident would convict him. But in the wake of the Linda Brown case, blacks were getting a level of justice before the courts that made Mississippi whites nervous, and they were afraid that Parker might go free. And so on the night of April the 24th, 8 men with masks or bandanas over their faces and white gloves on their hands turned up at the county courthouse. and brought the jailer upstairs with them to the second-story cell block, where they made him unlock this door and open it up. While the men were spilling into the cell here, the jailer, who also had a mask over his face, tried to calm down the prisoners in the other cell opposite. One of the prisoners afterwards said what they were really afraid of was that the mob, which had been expected, everybody knew why it was coming, might not get the right Negro. Well, the right Negro, of course, was Mac Charles Parker, who was trying to hide behind the toilet screen at first. But pretty soon he was involved in a fight for his life, and it must have been quite a fight. Nurses in the little hospital across the parking lot could hear the screams and the yells. And before long, the unconscious body of Parker, which was bleeding quite a lot, was dragged out of the cell and down the steps and into a waiting car. It has been called the last classic lynching in America. The prisoner abducted from his cell with the connivance of the jailer and the approval of the town. The end of the road for Mac Charles Parker came here on the Bogalusa Bridge over the Pearl River on the Louisiana-Mississippi state line. They stopped, pulled him out of the car here, and when he realized what was coming, Parker made a last desperate attempt to try and run for it. And I guess that's when they shot him. The plan had been to castrate him first and then to hang him from the metal superstructure of the bridge. But now that he was dead, there didn't seem to be much point in that. And so they wrapped his body in chains, threw it off the bridge into the Pearl River. Originally, Parker had been held in a lockup cell in his hometown of Lumberton, and the local lawyer, Bobby Garraway, had heard people talking openly of lynching. Why did this spirit of violence blow up all of a sudden?
You've got to go back to the Brown case in '54, which reversed the entire race situation as far as the South was concerned. It meant, in effect, that our schools had to be integrated. It was the beginning of the end of the old Southern traditional ways. The Supreme Court had spoke loud and clear to us, and people down here were upset. They had got used to their traditional ways, and they were highly upset. They didn't want to make a change.
It was close to 30 years ago that the people living here took the law into their own hands, fighting changes that were to envelop their society. A new generation of whites and blacks has grown up in the South, and there are many problems still, but it's a vastly different society from the one their parents knew. Did you change during all this period in your own attitudes towards race relations?
I think most Southerners did. I was originally a segregationist. As events started unfolding, I started thinking about the matters. Number one, I was an American. I had gone to Korea in the Korean conflict. And then the rightness of things that are involved. I didn't like to see people taking law into their own hands. My studies of that is it just doesn't work, that we had to be ruled by law, and I believe in the system. I believe in democracy. So I had to come around and change my views.
These children have a greater degree of freedom than their parents or grandparents ever knew. And it's been possible because America has a court which is at the heart of its social and political life, which is capable of reflecting the country's shifting moods, and yet which speaks for the Constitution that made it. For every democracy, it's a different experience. Britain, which gave America its common law, Magna Carta, and independent judges, is still grappling with the problem of making law accessible to those who most need it. Most white people in Britain look on the police with respect, even affection. The unarmed British Bobby is seen as a symbol of an ordered and peaceful society. But there's a new class of underprivileged in Britain, the thousands of black immigrants who began arriving in the 50s. They often see the police as an enemy.
The sort of theme that I'd like to take this evening is the theme of law and justice.
Tony Gifford, a British barrister and a lord, has for years sought to dispel the notion that British justice is somehow perfect. He says that the law should define the rights of citizens, as it does in America, in my own country, Canada, and in many European nations.
Unfortunately, law, far too frequently as it is taught, and even more as it is practiced, seems to have very little to do with justice. I mean, it may be a truism to say that the less money you have, the less power you have, the more injustice you are likely to suffer, because the more likely it is that people will trample on your rights, and therefore the more legal help you will need. I believe that if people knew they had rights, that they were part of the law, you could actually assert before the courts, not that some statute or other applied or didn't apply, but that some basic right was being infringed.
Your people, we're people. If we do wrong, arrest us. Don't beat us. Don't kill us.
To many in Britain, the law is remote, mysterious, a sort of ritual involving people from another planet speaking a language that nobody is supposed to understand.
I believe it is designed to awe people, to say to the outside world, we are the guardians of a kind of mystery which you're never really going to understand. I think people should respect the courts if they are worthy of respect, if their decisions are being handed down in a way which broadly corresponds to people's idea of fairness, not respect them because they are dressed up in funny gear. The whole business of wigs, for instance. I mean, the idea of women being dressed up in the headdress of 18th century gentlemen, I mean, it is quite ridiculous.
In 1970, Lord Tony Gifford helped to establish the first free legal aid centre in Britain, based on similar centres across America.
Our law centre can help you.
They have spread to every corner of the country, and Gifford has encouraged a generation of young lawyers to believe that the law in a democracy must protect those who need it most.
There must be an absolute right for people who are affected by the law to be able to say something about that law. The people who we work for are affected by the law. We, on their behalf, say something about that law that affects them, and that must be law and democracy.
A painful discovery that we have made about the law is that it does not become justice automatically, simply because the people have wrested it out of the hands of a monarch or a tyrant. It seems to me that one of the most powerful tensions in a democracy is between law as an expression of what the community wants and law as a protection of the rights of individuals or minorities. On the surface, law should represent the values of a community, but suppose the community wants to use the law for evil purposes. Nazi Germany. It's important to remember that Adolf Hitler did not seize power. His government began as the legally elected government of Germany, and the atrocities he committed were sanctified by laws drawn up in Nuremberg, the Nuremberg Laws. The laws were designed, and I quote, for the protection of German blood and honor. They were passed at a Nazi Party Congress in 1935, approved by Parliament, and enforced by the courts. Added to year by year, they would strip Jews and everyone the state found undesirable of the right to education, property, and citizenship. They would lead to the concentration camps, the gas chambers, the ovens, and finally the undesirables would lose the right to life itself. Arno Hamburger was a teenager when the Nuremberg laws were promulgated, and he watched bewildered and afraid as the rule of law was perverted in his country.
The law was altered to the beliefs of the Nazis, and then they said what they did was only complying with the existing law.
Arno Hamburger was there on Crystal Night, and for 2 days and nights, Nazi brown shirts smashed Jewish property throughout Germany.
Of course, I remember the Crystal Night. I was 15 at that time. I had a cousin who was born on September 8th, 38. They had to carry the baby from room to room, and the SR smashed everything in the flat. There wasn't a cup or a spoon or a plate left in the morning. Everything was broken up. It was fearful, it was tough, and it was frightening. You suddenly didn't belong anymore. You just were an outcast.
When Hamburger left Nuremberg in 1939, there were 9,500 Jews in the city. When he returned at the end of the war, there were 8 left, 2 of them his parents, who had spent the war hidden from the Nazis in a small room in a building in the city's Jewish cemetery. Hamburger began working as an interpreter with the Allied War Crimes Council, learning at first hand what men and women had done in the name of the law. To this day, I have trouble comprehending how a nation as civilized as Germany could have descended so swiftly into barbarism. There had been a democracy before Hitler, with a constitution that proclaimed liberty and justice and the rights of individuals. That constitution had been smashed like the glass on Crystal Night.
First victims of the Nazi dictatorship were the Germans themselves, and the extent to which this devilish machine had seized hold of people and used the machinery of a state itself to carry out the exterminations of what we reckoned in Nuremberg to be about 12 million men, women, and children.
Lord Elwyn-Jones, former Lord Chancellor of Britain, was a young prosecuting lawyer with the British team which, together with Russia, France, and America, went back to the very place in Germany where the laws that killed millions had been passed. There, in a trial without parallel in history, the victors prosecuted those responsible for the Nuremberg laws. Non-Germans would hold Germans accountable for crimes against humanity. It would change the way we perceive law.
The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated.
You must plead guilty or not guilty. Ich kenne mich im Sinne der Anklage nicht schuldig.
Nein,
nicht schuldig.
Nicht schuldig.
Before Nuremberg, the doctrine and approach of international law was that the way in which a government treated its own people was entirely a matter for the sovereign decision of that sovereign state. After the war and the creation of an international code of human rights through the agency of the United Nations Charter, that transformed the position of the individual human being, wherever he might be, as a matter of law, from being a mere object of compassion to being a subject of rights.
That idea would transform law in Western Europe in a way that was nothing short of revolutionary. Nations that had fought each other for centuries would create a court in Strasbourg, the Court of Human Rights, and another one in Luxembourg, the Court of Justice, which would sit in judgment on the very countries that had created them.
Open the public hearings in the case of Lechner.
21 judges sit on the Court of Human Rights from the countries which are members of the Council of Europe. The only non-European, representing Liechtenstein, is a Canadian judge, Ronald St. John MacDonald, professor of law from Nova Scotia.
I think the European Court of Human Rights is one of the great judicial tribunals that exists in the world today. It's a tremendously dramatic development in the changing of the legal structures around the world. Because, 40 years ago, less than that, the idea that a third party outside the state could pass on the quality of the relationship between the national government or state and its citizen was unheard of, virtually. This is, I would say this is revolutionary. This is one of the really revolutionary things that has happened in law and in international law in our lifetime, in our generation. And it's going to go on, and it's going to go on.
Never in the history of Europe have so many men and women had so much access to the law. These people, more than 400 million of them, have the opportunity to take their own governments to court if they feel their rights are being infringed. Here are two married Irish women who've made the journey to the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. They're taking their own government to court because it's paying them a lesser rate of unemployment benefits than it pays single women and married men. Not only will they win their case, but their government will change the law in Ireland to conform to the court's ruling. In the struggle to create societies with equality before the law, like the one started in Greece some 25 centuries ago, we've come a long way. In Western Europe alone, 14 countries have incorporated the European Convention on Human Rights into their domestic law. One of them is the western part of Germany, where those infamous Nuremberg laws came from in the first place. And one thing we've discovered is that nothing so defines the difference between tyrannies and democracies as does the law. It's the most important tool we have with which to shape the communities we want.
The needs of the community for peace and order are often in conflict with the rights of the individual. The task of the law is to strike a balance between the two. It's an endless task. It's never perfect. It sort of works. And those are profound truths both about law and about democracy.